1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 8 seconds that I've been standing here, we've lost the equivalent of 2 football fields of the rainforest. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a sustainable solution for the people of these developing countries, nor justified for the future generations of these planets. That is why Team Denmark is so incredibly proud to be proposing the motion that this House believes that developing countries should prioritise environmental protection over resource extraction. Now, we're going to prove 2 things for you today. First of all, that this is a beneficial prioritisation for the developing countries themselves, and secondly, why this is a completely necessary tool in the fight against climate change. What Team Bat called Lotto, and I have to prove this debate in order to win, is that every single individual will benefit from this resource extraction when we already know environmental changes is harming everyone. Now we're going to prove this for a 4-point case. First of all, nature of resource extraction. Secondly, economic benefits from this prioritization. Thirdly, moral necessity. And fourthly, my partner Clara will talk to you about increased bargaining power in international relations. But before I get to my first contention, let's lay out the model proposed by Team Denmark today. First of all, we find resource extraction, things like mining, things like extracting oil or foresting in the Amazon. We're defining environmental protection as generally not building roads within the Amazonas and rainforests to enable this kind of unsustainable extraction of resources, and furthermore, just all these kind of measures that prevent further carbon emissions. An example of this would be the government of Nigeria trying to find other sources of energy than oil to base their economy upon. Now, we define prioritise as generally reduce the amount of resource extraction, or simply just doing it in a sustainable way that doesn't directly hurt the environment as it is seen in the status quo. The way we see that we implement this resolution is likely in the same manner that developed countries at the Paris Climate Summit has pledged $100 billion to developing countries until 2022 in order for them to implement such environmental protectionist measures that we are looking for today. Now, moving into my first control point about the nature of this resource extraction. First, I'm going to look at the issue of who actually gets the money in these countries. 2 actors. First of all, the oligarchs in the country. Secondly, foreign companies. Okay, so we see that in these countries, natural resources means money, and money means power. That is fundamentally why we see that a lot of very strong and powerful oligarchs in the country are actually the ones deriving all the benefits from this resource extraction. We give the example of the former administration of Nigeria under Goodluck Jonathan, who directly reaped all the benefits from the oil revenue of that country. Now, what happens when, no thank you, we begin to prioritize this environmental protection? Well, we argue that the fact that these resources go to these oligarchs is incredibly harmful because it perpetuates the already unequal power structures of the country. Once we begin to mitigate the importance of the natural resources, we're actually trying to create a foundation for an equalizing of the power structures in this country. Very, very important. Now, second aspect in this country is the foreign companies. We give the example of South Sudan, where China tries to buy a large amount of areas to extract all the resources. That means that in the status quo, the amount, the monetary value of these resources doesn't even go to the developing countries themselves, but are simply just being extracted out of the country in the status quo. It's fundamentally harmful. Before I end this point, I'll take a few more.
South Africa gives money when it gives gold to the American government. This is much better than not receiving any form of revenue from our very resources and prioritizing what you want to do.
Well, you see, that's generally a trade-off. You can either get this short-term economic growth in terms of GDP. As I've just outlined to you, we don't even think that GDP is a proper measure of this debate, since it really only goes to the powerful elite of these countries. We argue that even in this case, if the money actually went to the people, we would still be okay with not allowing that, because we get the environmental change we support on our side of the house. Now, ending this point, it's important to make a utilitarian comparison. Who benefits from these resource extractions in the status quo? Oligarchs and foreign companies. Who benefits from environmental protection? The entirety of the global community and the people of these countries, as I'm going to outline in my second argument. We'll touch upon the economic benefits of this prioritization. Let's firstly examine the short-term harms of this resource extraction. Well, first of all, I'll just outline to you that you might experience short-term growth in GDP. Very harmful since the money actually doesn't even go to the population itself. But you're also destroying the prospect of these people actually getting benefits from this if you're doing it in an unsustainable way. We see the Amazonian tribes directly dependent upon these kind of natural resources, actually not being able to, no thank you, get the benefit of this on the long term because of lack of regulation and because of an unsustainable approach to this issue. Now, how do we change that with prioritizing environmental protection? Well, first of all, we also argue that now we're actually keeping these very important tools in terms of climate change in check. For instance, the Amazonian rainforest is incredibly important in terms of mitigating the effect of carbon emission. We're maintaining that on our side. But we're also diversifying the economy. Because now you're not only basing your sole revenue on these natural resources, but you're forced to seek other alternatives. We give the example of Saudi Arabia. When the general world becomes less dependent on oil, they try to diversify their economy and seek other alternatives to this. No, thank you. We argue this is incredibly important because they have a more stable economy, not dependent on this so limited resources, Mr. Speaker. Now, moving on to 7, no thank you, the interaction with the world economy. Now, we've seen a fundamental change in mindsets of developed countries in terms of climate change. An example of this is President Obama's bilateral climate deals with China and Iran. We see that people are generally becoming more mitigating the effects of climate change. Now, let's just briefly go inside the head of the average Western consumer. They begin, the direction of the long-term world economy is that they begin to prefer fair trade. They begin to prefer, furniture not made from unsustainable foresting in the Amazons. In order to meet the demand from the developed countries, the developing countries has to reform their approach to this in terms of creating sustainable trade. We also argue there's also direct regulations in terms of this, because at the Paris Climate Summit, we saw that developed countries engaging in common regulations in terms of standards of the products. If these countries actually want to participate in this kind of trade, they need to prioritize environmental protection as well. No thank you. Now, thirdly, let me address the issue of the moral necessity to do this. It's important that you keep in mind throughout this point that even if you don't buy any of our practical analysis, this point is justified in and of itself. We argue that environmental change is the largest threat to the global community right now. Because the developing countries are capable of actually trying to mitigate the effect of climate change, they have a moral obligation to do so. Now we might hear from team opposition that now's their time to shine. Like the developed countries has industrialized all that kind of jazz, right? But we argue that now we have the available information to actually make a change. That is why they fundamentally have a moral necessity to do so. We also argue that now they can actually try to incentivize the developed countries to try to mitigate climate change even further because they're taking a global moral stance to this. Mr. Speaker, because we're the ones who actually make sure that the profits go to the people of these countries and not simply just foreign companies and oligarchs inside the country. Because we're the side that actively tries to fight climate change. We are so incredibly proud to be the side that tries to save the planet. Thank you.
Ja, shi ne da za ku adoptin da su da ka lura yana faɗa wani da ne da ke kwanta suna yin because what they do they are using the natural resources. They will use the natural resources. We benefit from the natural resources that are not the interest needs. It's just the thing that those kind of development countries issues that are everybody is also
obligation that they gave it to the son of the house because it simply does not address and simply does not recognize the nature of developing states, and their analysis simply ignores these developing states. Ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to oppose. We've got two burdens to prove here. One, that prioritizing environmental protection is not an effective tool for achieving the significant development of developing countries. But secondly, that prioritizing resource extraction is actually more beneficial because it simply recognizes the importance and the nature of the developing states. How will we do so? Using two simple points. One, as the first people will look at how why government in developing nations have the principled and practical imperative to not prioritize environmental protection rather. My second speaker will therefore look at how we then extensively harm the development prospects of developing nations by prioritizing these environmental action. But before that, let's go to my rebuttal and reshape this debate and go to the first world country, the second world country rather, that the son of the house actually comes from. One, we're dependent on these resources, right? We simply don't have any other means of income because the investment that we receive from countries like China, the investments we receive from countries like America is dependent on the extraction of these resources. We also tell you that why this is inherent, however, is the idea that even if we're exploited, it's not because of the presence and the extraction of these resources in the first place. It's because of the fact that governments simply don't want to opt into means that they can do this for themselves and simply don't have the capacity to do so. However, what actually develops these states is when you look at the inherency of the economy. Because ideally, what's that opposition trying to prove to us in this debate? That the dependency, it's our proposition rather, that the dependency on this resource extraction simply does not exist, and that environmental action, environmental protection is actually more significant. Because what actually worsens the situation, because the only examples that they actually gave us were those of industrial states, right, and the power that they actually have. They never went to states like Brazil, where the economy is dependent on the sugar trade, where the economy of South Africa is dependent on the gold and mining that we actually receive. They must go to these second-world countries, right? But extensively, we also told you that we think that the exploitation that they still try to run away from still exists and is further exacerbated on their side of the house. Why? Because all the attention is on these environments. It makes it easy for these states to exploit the idea that there is no priority of the economy because they simply have leeway to actually take these resources from themselves without having the guilt. Why do we think that this actually exists, right? Because the main attention is on the idea that no, the environment is very important without recognizing that we actually allow these multinational companies and these countries to go through battles in order to still get to that goal. We think that this is something that's very problematic, especially to South Africa and all these other states, right? But also, even if this analysis did not exist, right, they said in the policy that developed states will actually give us 1 million in order to actually protect these people. That still creates the dependence because they simply prove that these states can't do it on their own with the money that they receive from the economy, especially from these resource extractions. We think that we're more substantive because we mean that just because we don't prioritize environmental protection, we don't disregard its importance, especially within society we take in today's debate, right? But furthermore, what investment, especially for the sector, we think that side proposition has a lot to do, right? But furthermore, they simply don't understand how dire the situation is in those states. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about miners constantly being within mines because they simply know that not only do they have a duty to themselves, they also have a duty to the state in order for them to create the change that they so want this mining to actually be. So what are we talking about? We're telling you that when black people, especially those that actually work within these mines, succumb to the idea that there is some level of power that we're supposed to give to our superiors in order to secure ourselves a position and some level of protection of our resources, right? We think that this is more substantive. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll further integrate my responses within my matter. So what's my thesis here, right? That not taken, right? One, this priority of environmental protection is not the right thing to do, but secondly, that we achieve better development through resource extraction. So this is why I actually do side propositions job for them and tell you why we are developing states because of their true nature, right? So we tell you that governments have an immediate responsibility to develop the lives of individuals because we simply can't have a convention where government says, well, listen, society, we're going to prioritize the economy now because well, there simply is so much harm in carbon dioxide, right? We think that you can't explain that to the society because what societies want is a better standard of living. What societies want is the utility of these resources. If it means that there will be a greater benefit to them, what societies want is development. How they don't ensure that, however, there simply is no security that there is a direct obligation environmental needs actually do in order to fulfill ours.
This is the bit of the comparative. Please show why the short-term economic benefits that your side house provides is more important than the environmental.
I was actually getting to that, right? What short-term means, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's still no economic development of these states. How do you think South Africa got to the way it actually is right now? We think that they recognize the importance of actually ensuring that American-based investment actually caters to the society, but secondly, they ensure that they actually create a better investment in order to achieve the benefits that are so current within today's rate. You're losing, right? But furthermore, we tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, that government's immediate responsibility means that the improvement of growth of the economy, that the protection of this environment. So what are we telling you here? So we think that there's a greater need for fast industrialization because these nations are simply stagnant or slow in developing. That's our problem here. That's why when you do with things like priority, the ultimate benefit is that of developing the economy within those states, right? But secondly, we also told you that there's little capacity to be dependent to produce these things from themselves, and in order, we think that this is because they're simply not in a position to actually do so, especially to make such rash decisions of prioritizing, right? But furthermore, we tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, the lack of industrialization actually does a lot of harm to this. So what are we telling you? Yeah. So we think that you limit the amount of job opportunities that are actually offered, especially by these companies that actually come into these states, right? So we tell you that not a lot of businesses are extracting the resources and actually requiring employment. Therefore, the situation of these individuals is actually worsened with this priority. But secondly, we also tell you that developing nations are primarily dependent on primary sector and the secondary sector. So when we tell you that the priority of the environmental protection rather lessens the revenue from the tertiary sector because agriculture is simply failing, right? But secondly, even if this analysis did not exist, we tell you that the problem is not as dire within these developing nations. We tell you that these countries are only starting to be industrialized as compared to the industrialized countries that they're actually talking of. But developing nations have signed, even if this analysis did not exist, right? We tell you that developed nations have signed treaties and legislature that mandates them to take care of the environment without prioritizing. So what are we talking about? We're talking about those gold mines and Kimberley that are obligated to make sure that there is a protection of there is some tax that they actually pay to ensure that the reparation of that harm to that environment is better mitigated. We tell you that the businesses operating within these states, right, pay these taxes in order to assist governments in ensuring that the environment is better protected because there simply is a recognized obligation to the environment. We think that this is better. But also extensively, we betternly hold these businesses accountable when we prioritize the economy and prioritize the extraction. Why do we say so? They in the limelight should there be exploitation. That's why South African governments right now know that the investment of America is very exploitative and are weighing out their options as to what extensively benefits the child within South Africa, especially for the future. But furthermore, we also told you that developing nations need to strengthen their industrialization before they can even think about the environment. So not only are we better for the environment because it's incidental, we also better for the society because we simply recognize the importance. Ladies and gentlemen, stand our position in today's debate. Thank you.
tabbar uba ne amma gaba ɗaya kun shi ko ne kuke ba ainihin mun kwanta shi ba ta tafi da sai mun kwanta sai gaba zai buge sai ta present solid argument the fact is he recently controlled Nigeria. As a Nigerian, she already counted this new topics and she presented a new argument for the This is a new practice. It's a new practice. She cannot debate, she cannot rebut his points because her point is not based on facts. It's based on something that already happened. It's just like the law. You cannot counter the law, but you can present a new law. This is this thing is very new. This is
Let us make one thing abundantly clear. In the long term, you cannot have both. When you say that you would not prioritize environmental protection through what they're saying by simply extracting as many resources right now, what you're inevitably doing is directly harming the countries within the long run. They try to give us this cruel mischaracterization of every single developing country only having one sort of mineral that we're depending on. We're telling you this is a flawed characterization. What you must be aware of in this debate is the fact that the average life of the people within these sort of countries are largely dependent upon things such as agriculture. She gave you the example of sugar. Why is that crucial in today's debate? Because these agricultural elements are the ones that are directly harmed by the fact that we go ahead and do not prioritize environmental protection, because that's how we harm the life of the average person within these countries. The average person that gets absolutely nothing when we have these sort of corrupt governments, as we tend to see in developing nations taking these money. Having already cleared that up, let's get into some pieces of remarks. First idea, the idea of Brazil, just because she said so. Okay, Brazil, essentially she's trying to tell us that Brazil is basing their economy upon sugar. Essentially we tell you that is correct. What is the problem right now when they do not prioritize environmental protection? What they do is they go in there, they cut down the rainforest. The rainforest soil, as some of you may know, is aerosol, meaning you can literally only use this for 4 years. Why is it important? Because that means you can only have a full year resource of what could else have been fruitful environmental things that is directly beneficial to the entire economy, the entire world global climate scale as well. So what they're willing to do is get 4 years of having some sort of sugar here, as opposed to getting this elsewhere. Why is it important that we get this elsewhere? Because when you begin to go ahead and make this sort of trade-off where you cut down the rainforest, you're increasing things such as strokes happening. No, thank you. Meaning that countries such as Brazil, just because she said so, can no longer go ahead and grow things such as sugar, which their economy is largely dependent upon. So in the case where you really want to make this sort of argument that these people, that we shouldn't prioritize the fact that we need to cut down, and I'll take it in 20 seconds, that we shouldn't be able to cut down, have more environmental protection, you're literally contradicting your entire case. But you seem to be disagreeing.
What you don't understand is that whether or not we like it, there will be some level of harm done to the environment, even under your policy, because we simply don't have the money to ensure that we maintain that environment.
Sit down, please. Did you hear our model? 100 billion a year to developing countries to make sure that they go ahead and do these kind of things. No, thank you. I'll get into this later in my kids. But even if I take your argument, saying that, oh, we need to have these things quiet, we need to have these sort of resource expectations, then you seem to be basing all this on this false assumption that the money we get from this actually goes to improve the environment. This is speaker, that's not what we have seen in the status quo. That's not what's going to happen in the status quo. These are going to be continued to be taken by current governments and the oil giants. So let's look at what she did say. It was essentially like, governments have a responsibility. Well, if we can see that governments have a responsibility, then they have an even greater responsibility to the long-term generations that we're going to see happening. Second piece of rebuttal, no thank you. What they're essentially saying is that governments then only have the responsibility to the for-you people, which I will reprove to you is not going to help anything or the economy in the long run. Nothing. We also like take away this entire idea of governmental responsibility. We kind of like don't believe in it because what we primarily see happening is governments just taking everything to themselves. So essentially they put in this assertion that everyone benefits from resource extraction in these countries. No thank you. We already made it very clear from Emil speaks that the people that benefit within the top. So we think that even if we go ahead and make the trade-offs, we'll have less resource extraction, or we're going to do less of it because it's going to be more expensive because we're protecting the environment now. And this is not actually going to harm the average person because you literally cannot put these rates kind of lower. So the only people we're going to be taking a little bit of revenue from is the people in the top. So even in your like argumentation of benefiting these people, you're not actually helping anything. Second thing you have is like, oh, we need to keep like businesses accountable. Mr. Speaker, we tried to do this and it is not working. We have people such as Apple, no thank you, and Foxconn. Essentially what we see happening there is these people are directly exploiting these people. And what do we get? Well, I'm standing with a knife, and I'm fairly sure the rest of you guys do too. No thank you. And let's just like talk a little bit about the things that they had completely like left out and didn't in any way engage with, which is like kind of horrible to the case because it's actually the most important aspect. First of all, this idea of we have a principal obligation to support the environment. We have a principal obligation not only to the globe, no thank you, not only to the next generation, but also to my own as a Brazilian sugar farmer in Brazil to do this to survive, no thank you, on 5 years, to still have some sort of income, which I will not have if I go ahead and harm the environment. No thank you. Sadly, then they kind of never really engage with this idea of you can actually diversify your economy. You're not just kind of one resource. We think it's kind of like easy for you guys to say that, oh, South Africa, we only have gold. Like, I don't know as much about South Africa, but I don't really think that's true. Like, of course, you must have some sort of infrastructure. No, thank you. And essentially, they completely did not in any way regard the entire concept of land grabbing, as Emil told you with South Sudan and China. Why is land grabbing the most important thing in this debate? Because what we see happening with resource extractions in the developing world right now, no thank you, is rich countries such as China going in there, buying from the government, which we're supposed to use these money to like benefit the population. We haven't seen that in South Sudan, really, that doesn't stand. To go ahead, buy this sort of land so they can directly profit from this, having people work in horrible conditions. What this then further proves is the idea that China is allowed to do basically whatever they want within these sort of countries. Why is that harmful? Because China benefits, the developing nations get absolutely nothing from it. But insofar as the developing nations said, no, we will not allow you to have this sort of resource extraction unless you do this in an environmentally sustainable way, well, China would probably still go ahead and do so. There's a lot of money to earn. So what we'll see happening is simply just a direct benefit because now the rest of the country don't have as many no thank you wrongs happening, which would like directly harm every single farmer in South Sudan elsewhere. That is the point, it is crucially remembered in today's debate. The people who are benefiting is not who they are talking about. So let's make this time then point no thank you of this bargaining nature. Essentially, what we want to argue is in terms of long-term change. If we want, they kept on telling us that, oh, we're a poor country, we can no way afford this. And that's why they need other rich countries to go ahead and like help you give you money. No thank you. We think it's crucial. We think developing countries already acknowledge that they cannot afford this. You said it yourself clearly. So why is it good? No thank you. Why is it good that we go ahead and get these sort of countries? Why is it good that we now begin to use the money we're giving to prioritize the environmental protection? Because then we begin to change the thing that whenever you give foreign aid, just give into some sort of corrupt government. Because that's what makes sure you don't get any other kind of foreign aid in the long run. No thank you. If you ever want to have this sort of economy where you can get help from developing nations, get help to things such as climate change, which are really just going to be beneficial to all of us if you accept, then you must begin to show the kind of results. Meaning that with the money that is given, you must begin to directly prioritize it. No thank you, so we can see the direct and big results, which will allow people to go ahead and want to exchange them further. We think that when you begin to use your environmental protection as a bargaining chip, that's when you can go ahead and use this, for instance, like getting more free trade, getting greater foreign aid, because it's actually being used as something that developed nations acknowledge as important. Let's lastly just talk about this structural change. Essentially what we see happening is when the countries say, we will not allow you to come into our country with resource extraction if you do not uphold a certain level of environmental protection, no matter how much it harms your extraction of these resources. And we make sure that every single company who's probably still going to want to go in these countries, because let's be honest, labor laws don't really change over a day, it's still going to be cheap anyway. But now they're going to change the way that they extract these sort of resources to not be able to adhere to the country standards. So what you're making sure is that all of these companies that would else be benefiting now have to change the way in which they operate within these countries, because which means that overall you're going to have greater environmental protection from these little countries, because they're going to have to adapt when we begin to prioritize. The fundamental thing you have to remember is that there's a huge principle level which they have not responded to, which is the most important thing. We cannot let the climate continue to go as badly as it's been. Thank you.
It's kind of the issues we have is getting
See, oh God, which of you think is really Canada? The care should this is a peaceful thing, this but there has been some people
First things first, their entire case is contingent upon the idea that developing nations are solely responsible for environmental harm. Secondly, their case is particularly harmful for them in the instance where these very same developing nations they just went are very dependent on these very same developed nations. And what they do is that they exacerbate that dependency, and I'm going to show you why in a moment. Let's do a bit of rebuttal. They tell us here in their first speech, and they give us this whole idea of who actually gets the money in today's debate. It's two axes. They tell us here is these foreign companies and these oligarchs. Let's give you a couple of responses. The first idea here is that the reason this happens, is because these very same developing nations lack the machinery to make sure that they benefit the economy, the very same environment. What this means is that under Proposition's model, is that they prioritize the prioritization on the environment. The more they prioritize on the environment, it means that the less money goes into these very same industries to better the machinery they use. What does this particularly mean for these very same countries? Secondly, we need to understand who actually provides these very same environmentally friendly equipment. Is this developed countries? Secondly, is those very same foreign companies that you say are very harmful legislation. So in the case of Proposition's model legislation, they in a sort of way don't actually continue to benefit these very same developing nations. Let's talk about about their moral obligation. It says here the moral obligation solely exists because of the reason that environmental harm engagement are the largest threats in the 21st century. I'm going to flag this into my maths and show you why that really is harmful, even more harmful under their case. But let's talk about agriculture. Let's say that agriculture isn't necessarily as harmful engagement. Let's be realistic about this. Sit down. The idea of agriculture, when they go for farming engagement, they use chemicals that are particularly harmful to the environment. So we tell you, the more you use that excuse engagement, when you say that agriculture can still carry on, still means that the very same harms under your model still exist in engagement. Sit down. The second thing I'm going to respond to is this whole idea on the second speaker's speech about accountability. We tell you there's less accountability taken in this instance because the less resources we extract under their definition of engagement. We tell you it means that there's less money going into the businesses and there's less profit. What does this mean, engagement? It means that even if these businesses resort to less environmentally friendly methods of engagement, it means that we can't hold them accountable on the basis that they can't do anything about it because there's less money going into their companies anyway. So we tell you here that secondary resources engagement, we tell you these are things that are depletable, and they actually these are things that are depletable, and this means that they're going to last for a short period of time engagement, and this is not actually something that is long-term. So we'd rather benefit these countries in the long run engagement. The last thing I'm going to respond to is this whole idea that they tell us that governments take money from the economy engagement and keep it for themselves. I think, first of all, that's a contradiction in the instance where they say that very same government engagement doesn't necessarily cater to its people engagement, and yet they concede that government takes away money. Why is this a contradiction? On the idea that they say that people don't get money in that economy engagement, we say we blame those governments. And why is it important to blame those governments engagement? It means that under their model, when they reduce the idea of resource extraction, it means that they take more money from the economy than they're supposed to give to these very same people. They don't benefit the people in this debate. Society proposition needs to show us why the structural change that they so talk about is going to be very beneficial. Let's move on to a bit of substantive, and I'm going to show you why some of the matters that I'm going to flag are really important. I'll take you now, sir.
Would your side abandon any sort of environmental regulation for the sake of environmental protection?
No, sir. We're not going to abandon any sort of environmental protections engagement. We tell you in status quo what's really important is that status quo continues to protect the environment while still having these very same resources extracted. Why is this good engagement? It means that we benefit both sides of the equation in today's debate. Let's move on. My thesis here is that there's more harm done than good in prioritizing environmental protection. My duty on this point is particularly to show you why status quo is comparatively better to their policy. Let's deal with the first idea of how they make conditions worse in these very same conditions worse in terms of the environment. We look at what happens when they reduce revenue going to the industry engagement. Firstly, it forces these industries to resort to less environmentally friendly alternatives. This means using less renewable resources. Secondly, it means that there's more coal use engagement. It means extensively engagement. It means extensively they're going to be dumping in areas. There's going to be more water pollution. We tell you the reason why this is particularly true is that even if this was a lie, the reality is that these very same environmentally friendly alternatives are really expensive. So when they deny these people from actually extracting resources and receiving profit, they harm themselves engagement in terms of giving us better alternatives. And that is what's really important here is to show you that what happens is that it even goes to the extent of human rights violations, where these countries are forced to resort to things like child labor engagement. China's not afraid to do that, so they will do that. Let's talk about the reality in terms of the second idea. One, there's less projects by these very same businesses engagement in terms of corporate social responsibility on two levels. The environmental level, which I've just dealt with, and secondly, the social level. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why this happens again is that when there's less resource extraction, it means less profit. Two effects of this. Firstly, because costs are highly engagement and less money is going into this company, it means that less money is spent on these very same projects. One of two things will happen. One, it's either we don't get this very same social corporate responsibility that these businesses are mandated to give away, or secondly, it means that we have small-scale small-scale social corporate responsibility, which benefits less people under their model legislation. The reality is their model is harmful in this instance. And this is where we tell you about the moral obligation that they tell us about in the instance where they tell us that this is the largest threat. We tell you because they can't get any alternatives that are very environmentally friendly, because you deny them profit, we tell you because you deny them profit, we tell you it's exacerbated under your model. The second thing I'm going to resort to later, and this was their whole idea on dependency, and this directly clashes with these points, and this is how we harm the developing nations under their model extensively. We think they continue dependency on first world countries. How does this happen? In the instance where these very same countries, these very same companies receive less revenue, it means that they continue to rely on multinational corporations to employ their people, and multinational corporations to benefit these people and give them social corporate responsibility. We tell you that in the instance where these very same societies don't benefit from the local companies as much as they would like to, we tell you they don't give any substantial change. In that instance, we tell you you still give power to the developing nations in themselves. So what have I shown you here is that their policy is excessively harmful rather than a status quo legislation, because they don't allow these companies to receive profits from extracting these resources, so that these companies can therefore buy better alternative legislation in terms of assisting the environment legislation. We tell you as a side government, what they were particularly supposed to do legislation is show us how the harms in status quo are not equivalent to what they're actually trying to do in an instance where these developing nations have been trying consistently to resort to things like having solar panel legislation, things like having high electricity. They have not considered these things that are actually happening in status quo, why these not beneficial, and why will these work continuously if we better these situations in these development.
ya kamata ya raise in musu ƙarfi ya allocation kuma an ba su da su ba su da su na kasu da ya yi musu da mai aka cikin su
I know that this situation is desperate. I know that people need more means to thrive in most developing countries. But I also know that short-term thinking hinders long-term improvement. On side proposition, we understand this logic. And we understand that we need to care about the environment, not only for the developing countries themselves, but to save the planet as a whole. And that's why I'm so proud to propose today's motion. I've divided this debate into two things. Firstly, into how does this impact the economy, and secondly, the environment. So let's go into the economy, right? We think that once they prioritize the resource extraction, right, in the future, they're going to be dependent upon these kind of resources. That means that they aren't going to invest in other types of industries. They're simply always going to be dependent upon oil or mining. The very industries that they then neglect to invest in of the industries that actually have made the Western world rich. Those that have actually made them into the developed world not being developing anymore. Because in the status quo, it is such industries as research, also within the environmental field, that helps a country. But if you prioritize resource extraction, 100 years from now, you're going to be stuck behind at the back of the queue. We think that this is the kind of mindset we want to avoid. On our side, we force developing countries to invest in other industries, right? We think that specifically we force them to invest in the environmental industry. We think this is good because then you diversify the economy, but also cater towards the very industries that the developed world actually care about, also care about in terms of research, right? We think that in the long term, we need to do this and diversify the economy, right? So before I go on, I'll actually already take a few on.
What you have is established in today's debate that the dependency that exists specifically on this side of the house is mitigated because there's still dependency on the money we receive from these coastal countries in any case.
Right, I'm actually going to deal with that later, but I can do that right now. We think that what is going to happen is more like international cooperation as to how do you advance this kind of technology, how are you going to make an infrastructure that support this kind of industry, right? We think that that's going to happen. But we see, even if we conceive that this dependency is going to be here, let's look at the comparative. Is the dependency best in terms of environment, or dependency best in terms of resources? We think that it's the former of the two, that it's better to be dependent upon having technology from the means that are going to help the environment. No thank you. But we think that in the future, right, we think that we have explained right from the beginning where they're likely to fail if they prioritize resource extraction. Why is that? Well, we told you first of all that many foreign companies actually go into the developing world, and then they're going to derive many of the benefits. Why is that? Because simply in the developing worlds, there aren't actually the know-how or infrastructure to actually take care of these kind of mining or oil extraction. It means that the foreign companies can actually pressure the taxation that they're going to pay to the government extremely low, because otherwise they'll just be like, well, we'll see you in a bit because I'm not going to pay that high taxes. It means that in the developing world, they don't really derive any benefits to the government. But even if they do get some kind of taxation, they're more likely to go to corruption rather than the people themselves. So the money that you do lose out on, we think that they're comparatively small in regards to the massive benefits we get in terms of environment, right? So no thank you. But we say that secondly, right? We think that their response was that, well, we are dependent on resources, therefore we simply must extract those kind of resources. We think this is just a short-term logic, and we have to simply look towards what is going to happen in the end. We think that even if we actually harm the population short-term, we are willing to swallow that harm to save more lives in the long term, right? So it's saying that secondly also, we diversify the economy, as we've already explained to you, and why that's inherently good. But furthermore, what opposition needs to recognize is that we don't have unlimited resources. At some point in life, they're actually going to cease to exist. But when you're dependent upon that kind of resources in the future, and they cease to exist, what's going to happen to your economy as a developing world is it's going to crash, right? Because once you're going to be dependent upon this, you're going to cease to exist. You simply don't have an infrastructure or any other industries to partake in your economy, right? I think that is bad. We diversify it and avoid this from happening. No thank you. But then they said, we would prevent companies from, we think that companies are going to leave because of the high costs. We have a few responses. Firstly, we still think that comparatively, it's probably going to be cheaper in Nigeria than it is Canada, right? Because of the high wages, minimum wages, labor laws, etc. But think that secondly, all the restrictions that they're not going to implement in the developing world already exist in the developed world in most cases. It means that you just equal the playing field, but you don't increase the cost relatively to the developed world, right? So it's still going to be cheaper in the developing world. Companies are going to stay. What we made the point was that we increased the trade in the developing world. This is something they didn't really respond to. We've seen with the Paris climate summit, and we've seen with the deal that China and the US made in 2014, that actually the world is moving towards a place where we do care about the environment. It means that in most cases, there are going to be some kind of restrictions on the products that we do sell, that they have to be environmentally friendly. But what happens in their case, when they don't actually fulfill these kind of restrictions, is that they cannot sell their products to the foreign countries. This is something they have to respond to. Another point they didn't actually respond to was kind of great analysis in her argument about bargaining power, right? Then when how you increase the investment in the developing world, when you show that you are having results within the environmental protection, when that becomes the leverage that the developing countries have. I'm going into environment now. No thing. We asked them about the status quo and asked them, what kind of restriction do you support? They said, well, we support some kind of restrictions. We think that firstly, this is just conceding to their kind of own case. We think that's kind of like a contradiction. Because they have to support that they don't support the restrictions if they really care about the economy. Secondly, we say that this status quo isn't actually sustainable. We think that experts have predicted that there are going to be floods, that are going to be huge carbon emissions, that are actually going to make whole cities disappear. We think that that is not sustainable living in the status quo. Therefore, we think we need more kind of restrictions. Furthermore, an argument we are going to make is that once we think that now all people are going to agree, right? We think that the status quo, why it's been so hard to help the environment, is because the developed world have looked towards the developing world and said they're not going to take part in this, so we aren't going either. But once they take part, we can have cooperation, so everybody makes an effort in dealing with the environment. We think that furthermore, the point they made about holding companies accountable, that it's not mutually exclusive, rather, right? We think it also adequately dealt with this, which so told you how about it creates greater respect for responsibility for the environment, right? And how we can hold them better accountable. But even if you want to hold them accountable in terms of the environment, right? We don't think that you're going to get all the economic benefits you were talking about. In the end, we have to recognize that even if you harm a few in the short term, right? We think that we do help the economy in the developing world, but more importantly, we help the climate of the whole world. Thank
use to analyze today's debate is, do developing nations have an obligation to prioritize environmental protection? And the first thing that I'm going to address here is this idea that these individuals don't even get the very same monetary benefits from the very same extraction of the resources in those nations. So the first response that I'm going to give you, which is something that they also ignored from my first speech, is that it's much better, it's relatively better in fact, to receive a little bit of income from these resources than to not get anything at all. Because what they still haven't told us is how exactly are we going to secure economic benefits from these developing nations. But now why is this not going to happen? Because if you prioritize protecting the environment, it means that if there's oil somewhere under a forest, that the economy of this country is largely dependent on, we're going to prioritize saving the forest over the very same oil, over extracting the very same oil for this very same country. The problem with this is that it means that their government is in these very same countries doesn't get necessarily a very sufficient revenue to benefit the very same economy, as well as ensure that it has sufficient money to give back into improving the standard of living of the people. But on top of that, ladies and gentlemen, we're told that this is also inherently because the economies of these very same developing nations are largely dependent a lot on the very same resources, as well as on agriculture. I'll further deal with this point in terms of where I show you how we actually rather harm these countries in the short run. But the second that I'm going to tell you is why also this is relatively better, is that these very same private owners of businesses actually do give back into these developing nations. We talked about one, how these very same businesses are mandated by government to pay taxes, especially if they actually directly and proportionately harm the environment. The second thing that we told you is about corporate social investment and how not only do they have an obligation to ensure that they give government money from the resources that they extract or rather not harm society, but also to actually uphold the very same sustainability of the environment. What this means is that even if we don't prioritize environmental protection, governments in these countries already prioritize this obligation because it's something that is in fact inherently important. This already does happen. The third thing that we're going to tell you is that if you prioritize resource extraction, it means that government has a greater imperative to strengthen its economic policies and become much more self-sufficient. An example of this is South Korea. South Korea completely closed its economy, as well as prioritized less on things like environmental protection and actually focused more on the extraction of resources like aluminium to actually benefit its economy. What this did is that it gave South Korea a greater even revenue. And now what's great about this revenue is that once we have sufficient money, is that government can afford all of this expensive machinery that is necessary for us to actually protect our very environment. We think that this is much better because we prioritize having a lot more money in our economy. It means that we're able to extensively later on benefit the very same environment because we can afford this very same machinery. The second thing that I'm going to address here is this idea. The second thing that I'm going to address here is the idea that we only create short-term benefits because the money doesn't. That we only create short-term benefits because the money doesn't go into these very same products. And the first thing that we also want to tell you here is that this is because government can't necessarily manage its own resources. For example, South Africa with gold and diamonds. But secondly, this means that if they want us to actually prioritize the environment in this case, means that if the US, like they conceded, actually exploits these very same countries, this still happens in their model. Because while the US is busy continuously mining in our own country, it means that we're busy prioritizing environmental policies. This does not necessarily benefit these countries in the long run. But now the third thing that I'm then going to address here, also the second response that I'm going to give here, is when they tell us that governments in these countries also inherently just corrupt because they take money from these very same extraction projects and then keep it for themselves. But corruption doesn't even stop under their model because they don't stop government from actually keeping this money in any case. They need to actually ensure that they actually put pressure on government to strengthen its economic policies to ensure that the money that it gets actually goes back into the society. That's relatively better. The third thing, however, that I'm going to address here is this moral obligation that they say exists in today's debate. An inherent problem that we have with this first of all, we concede this moral obligation, we say it's true. But the problem that we have is that they capitalize strongly on second world countries. The people that contribute largely to climate change are first of all in first world countries. We thought that this is where this obligation lies largely. The problem that we have in today's debate is that they directly infringe on the sovereignty of these countries by controlling their policies to make them fix problems that are not even lovely by them. And the reason behind this, especially when Clara considered that these people actually depends more on agriculture, means that there's less industrialization happening in these countries, means that there's less pollution and harm to the environment. The harm is largely in first world countries. We cannot shift the majority of this burden to second world countries. So what we then conclude here is is that because they depend on this money for their economies, because they don't stop the corruption anyways, and because this moral obligation lies largely to these individuals, and because it is already fulfilled under a model, because prioritizing resources doesn't mean that we ignore this raising obligation. We told you in our speech about treaties like the treaty that the BRICS community actually has to protect the environment. These are things that in many cases government does not forfeit this responsibility. This actually brings me to my second question. The question here is, do we benefit developing countries by prioritizing environmental protection? And this is where largely I'm going to deal with the second biggest matter. Yes, Carl.
Insofar that resources are finite, and we proved to you how by not protecting the environment, you're making sure we just run out of these quicker. How are you possibly creating any sort of long-term
change? The idea here is that these countries are going to run out of these resources anyways. We need to make sure that when we actually do extract these resources and use them, that this is going to be something that's qualitative, or rather much more progressively contributive to our economies. But now, how does this then happen under our model? And the first thing that we do, and this is basically where we directly deal with this idea of how there aren't any long-term benefits. We talk about what happens when we extract resources is that we only harm that particular environment for a short period, because when we extract resources, they eventually run out. But now what's great about this is that when we receive all of that revenue, we are able to, first of all, better the conditions of that raising, or better the conditions of our people already in society. But two, it means that we're able to further invest in things like planting crops, especially in other alternative areas, because these resources are not just pretty much everywhere that we can't even fund agriculture. We think that on top of that, we are not better able to diversify our very same economies, because it means that now that we have the money on top of agriculture as well as manufacturing, it means that we therefore can in fact invest into things, into businesses in the tertiary sector, things like banking, things like telecommunications, things like transportation. We think that it happens much better when government has a revenue and government can in fact incentivize things like export promotion. But on top of the second thing that I'm going to address here is this idea of investment from bigger companies, especially when these developing nations prioritize protecting the environment. So the first thing that we're going to tell you here is that the problem with this is that this is only going to be applicable to developing nations, because this is going to be applicable to them because they don't in fact harm the environment just the exact same way as first world countries. But now that's relatively detrimental, because if this is only applicable to developing nations, it means that they're the only ones whose trade is only conditionalized upon the very same conditions that they upon the very same ability to protect the environment. And the problem with this is that it's first world countries that still contribute largely to detrimenting the environment, and not these very same developing nations in place. But the second thing and the only response that we got here was from the third speaker, when he said that it's not true. First world countries can actually protect the environment better because they already have the mechanism. One, this is not true. That's why America is also still suffering from things like drought, because they're actually still affected by the very same problems. But two, even if they have these very same mechanisms in machinery, it's still not equivalent to the harm that they actually do and to the very same problems of climate change that we're still not allowed. The last thing that I'm going to tell you is this idea that we actually change the way countries extract resources.
مثلا بقولك هجرت بيت هجرت في القصص This is what the Demetrius the first speaker did not give the content what is supposed to, just speaker give everything. This is what is so which is sweet things. I cannot at a judge now. That is why I judge. If I judge, definitely there was something like treatment in these cases. This creators they define they give reasons that they do research what is an issue. This is supposed to be in this case, that she was that is not been like racist. She was trying to make you know how much she gave me that is racist. What was So this one is that you should point out that you should make it wise. So you should always say it's if not automatically, you can carry the slides. But the third speaker gives the basic of what is supposed to be all development on words about Denmark, and she makes it substantively good.
Side proposition or strategically unstrategic within today's day. Let's listen clearly to what their policy was. One, we're going to make developed worlds give us millions and billions of money to invest into the environment. But secondly, that their benefits are simply not exclusive to what status quo is, because they first because did not tell us what the status quo is. Let me tell you, and this is something that I actually brought up within my group, right? So one, we told you that there are taxes that are posed to these businesses in order to repair the harm that they actually do to the environment, whilst they're no response, especially from the very aggressive Clara, the simply will no response. Secondly, we also told you that when you mandate a specific state, especially with environmental harm, you must first recognize what it does to the economy, because they come from a very better state when they simply, even with these carbon emissions, right, and harm to the environment, there simply is no ripple effect when they prioritize the environment, because their economies are better. Let's take it to the state that is directly affected by the cause of prioritizing the environment. Because we told you, when you easily make it easy for us to be exploited by American governments, you still don't achieve the same change you actually want to achieve. We also told you that when you did their benefits were simply not exclusive to status quo. Because what did they tell us here? They're like, one, there are restrictions. Two, we've got bargaining power. And three, we've got incentives for better machines. South Africa, what breaks, ladies and gentlemen, is not done. We told you that these things simply exist without having to prioritize the environment. Did they respond? No. We also told you that when you want to prioritize trade, it is very ironic because their first proposition speaker is that, no, ladies and gentlemen, we reduce the extraction of these things. So where are we going to get this trade from them? The environment? I don't think so, because when you actively want to create a substantial change, especially when you look at the economies of these things, we must look at whether or not we like it. There will be some level of harm. What do we do then? Why are we actually better in achieving this? And this is not something they simply didn't respond to, even with Alex's new matter, right? We also told you that developing nations have an immediate responsibility. So it means if there's a short-term benefit, it's because it's in order to create a better opportunity to create long-term benefits. They did not respond. We also told you, this is where we actually told you that when we prioritize this extraction, it means that we get the revenue in order to make sure that the environment is better protected. What do they say? No carbon emissions. We also told you that, ladies and gentlemen, when you want to do exploitation, don't further exploit these individuals, because the dependency that they actually spoke about was the fact that these governments are actually taking money from the economy. Therefore, the money that is supposed to benefit the people is not going anywhere. That is very ironic, because the same people that are supposed to regulate the money that comes in within, especially from these developed states, are the same governments that you're still going to give the money to. They're still going to spend this money. So what do we do then, right? We tell you they simply don't create change. What did we tell you? We told you that when we constantly tax these businesses, when we make sure that they're in the public eye, especially with the harm that is actually done, that's why South Africans know that America exploits them, but they're conscious because there is a benefit that is actually created. We told you that they simply did not respond to this. So we also told you that when you extract these adjustments, there's a better incentive because we actually hold people accountable. They did not respond to this. We also told you that their homes are mainly centralized in industrialized states because those are the people that constantly impose the harm within the environment. So not only are we actually good for the environment because under their policy they completely ignore the extraction, we're completely saying that we don't need to prioritize the environment in order to find value in it. Ladies and gentlemen, we win today's debate. Thank you.
This is sad.
Madam Speaker, people are starving because floods due to climate change have swamped their land. Mrs. Speaker, people are fleeing because there is no water. Mrs. Speaker, there are poles that are melting and there are species that are going extinct because of climate change. We must act now. Insofar that they have conceded the most important aspect of today's debate, they can't possibly win. Because if they concede that, and if they believe that this is the most important thing, that we do have this sort of moral obligation, then we must act, because they have not proposed any sort of alternatives. This is the solution. This is why we take today's debate. So let's just get into the three themes that we think are the most important ones. First of all, we think that the principal obligation, which they never addressed, the only response they had to this was, this is not really, the developing nations. They're like the developed nations doing already as much. We've already told you that developed nations are saying, yes, we are. This is something we have to stand to collectively. So since you guys have the ability to change something now, we will be the ones financing this. This is a global solution. This is not dependency. This is cooperation that is essential when we go ahead and change the things that we must. Because the principal obligation they never responded to was the idea of the next generation that is to come. Insofar their first argument conceded that governments have a responsibility to the population, then this works over to our favor because this continues further on than what is just right now. So even though we don't talk about that, even though it's the most important thing, then let's talk about why we still win today's debate. Two things. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the average person living in these sort of places. They continue to tell us that this person is going to be harmed because these companies with all this money are just going to pull out and he's going to have no way to earn a living. Madam Speaker, we told you this is wrong. What is it in their world? People in South Sudan, due to land grabbing, get absolutely nothing from the Chinese government, and they have no interest in ever changing this because, the government gets so much money. But in our world, we're going to have a country that goes in and let's say the country is in Brazil, and says that, you cannot build a new road through the rainforest, you have to use the already existing ones because this would harm the environmental protection. Why is that exclusively better? Because companies are not just going to pull out of a nation because they still kind of need these sort of minerals. Companies are going to adhere to the standards which we set out to them. The people that are going to be losing profit are the people within the top. We've been consistent. Because let's be honest, the wages in which these people live in are already so incredibly low that you're not actually going to cause any sort of impact upon this. So for the average person, the strategic mistake which they decided to have this debate upon today, they're not actually harming this sort of person because the people that they're harmed, that have to pay more, are the people within the top. Let's talk a little bit about this other person, the person that is the average sugar farmer, the guy who doesn't work in the mines, whose wages do not get cut. Okay. So in that world, they agree that the government should go ahead and cut the rainforest down in Brazil to go ahead and plant sugar plants. They never responded to the fact this is only going to be very short-term beneficial for this country because the earth is an aerosol, meaning once you have used it once, you can literally never use this anywhere again. So we ask you, what's more important? Consistent better climate or 4 years worth of production here? Essentially what we tell you is that in our world, we think that Brazil should look towards other mechanisms. We think we should invest in something else in sugar, or we think we should use the 100 billion that we got. Whether that is used by international bodies if it doesn't work with the government, whether that is used for whatever the COP21 proposed so when they made this sort of resolution, of course international bodies aren't going to give all this money to corrupt governments. However this may happen, we think that this will be far better than our side of the house because the short-term benefit in no way outweighs. So let's just briefly